The amount of misconceptions in the PC tech world is overwhelming, and few are more frustrating than those surrounding low-resolution CPU benchmarks. And I do think those ones take the cake, but I'll admit there are plenty great, frustrating misconceptions to pick from. And today we are, of course, picking low-resolution testing for like the third time now, fourth if you include our recent video series covering AMD's bad 5000 XT series benchmarks. The first video of mine that really tackled this subject, at least in more recent times, that was released almost 2 years ago now. And while in my opinion still very relevant, and it does nail the topic quite well, if I do say so myself, which I suppose I am, despite the pat on the back, I clearly failed because the amount of people commenting on all of the 9800X 3D reviews that I've seen, complaining about testing at 1080p, how outdated it is, it's not real world, it's misleading, the list goes on. The amount of people doing that is extremely disappointing. So today I am going to tackle the subject again because I know you guys are subscribed and love hearing me just whinge about people whinging about stuff. It's what we do best here at Harbour Unboxed. And hopefully the examples and explanations I have for you actually do end up helping. So it's whinging for a good cause, guys. You have to get on board with that. Now, to be fair, there are lots of comments on that previous video from people thanking me for creating that content, stating that it helped them better understand the subject. And now they do understand why low resolution CPU limited testing is really the best way to go about it, and really the only way that you should test the gaming performance of CPUs. So that's great to see. And I am aware that this is a vocal minority, so before you start typing in the comments saying, Steve, you big dummy, it's only a few people that think this, it's a vocal minority. Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, I'm a big dummy, and you're right, it is only a vocal minority. I think the most of the people subscribed to the Harbour Unboxed channel understand why CPUs are tested in the way they are, and what a CPU review is actually trying to achieve. So that being the case, most of you who are probably watching this video don't actually require it, but don't click away because I think there is some really interesting data here that will interest those of you who do understand this subject. But before we get to all the glorious benchmark graphs, let's talk about a few things. Firstly, I think it's important to establish what sort of gamer you are. And by this I mean, what kind of performance do you actually require to enjoy the games you play? Do you only require 60 FPS, maybe even less? If so, then in my opinion, CPU performance is never really going to matter that much to you. This is what would be considered, at least in my opinion, as more casual gaming. And that's fine. Please don't take offense to me calling you a casual gamer. It's not meant to be offensive. It's just there's a difference between casual gaming, which Tim typically dabbles in casual gaming and enjoys the hell out of it. But there's a difference between that and competitive gaming, which generally requires well over 100 FPS. So think games like Counter-Strike 2, for example. It's also a bit different on the high-end side of things, where single-player games like high refresh rates, they can also be enjoyed in a casual setting. It's just a higher-end experience, let's say. Now, what isn't fine is to force a single viewpoint on everyone. And while you might think low-resolution benchmarking is doing just that, it's absolutely not. Rather, it provides you with the full picture, the full spectrum of gaming performance. So again, not everyone is happy with 60 FPS, and not everyone is even happy with 100 FPS. There are games where going from, say, 200 FPS to 300 FPS or even more does make a real difference. And if you don't believe that, or you can't accept that reality, then that speaks more to your experience and play style and possibly your personality. But I'm not sitting on the couch for this one, so we won't go there. But I do want to make this clear. Gaming at 30 FPS, 60 FPS, or anything in between or even outside of that range is perfectly fine. You're welcome to enjoy and play games at whatever frame rate you see fit. You just need to be aware that a lot of PC gamers won't accept 30 FPS or even 60 FPS, and in fact are more comfortable with over 100 FPS. And this is particularly true for competitive shooters, as it is difficult to compete at lower frame rates. And at the very least, you are placing yourself at a disadvantage, which again is why competitive, those that partake in competitive shooters or whatever it may be, generally shoot for what you might think is the moon in terms of FPS performance. So if all you require is, say, 60 FPS at 4K, then just be aware that CPU reviews aren't necessarily tailored for just you. And in fact, high-end CPU reviews probably don't apply to you at all. Therefore, you need not watch them outside of personal interest. Of course, I would love you to watch them anyway. I'd even encourage you to do so. But in reality, the information, regardless of the resolution used, it won't really benefit you, as the product in question is likely going to be of little benefit to you, at least in the near term. Now, we often hear the argument, or at least similar arguments to something like this, I just want to see 1440p and 4K results, as that's more real world. It lets me know if my CPU upgrade will offer me any additional performance. The problem with this is I don't know what games you're playing right now, or the games you plan on playing over the next few years, and you probably don't know that either. And while I obviously don't know how future games will perform on existing hardware, I can safely assume that they will be more demanding than the games we have today, and therefore demand more of your CPU. I also don't know what settings you'll be playing with, and that will largely depend on how many frames you like to game with as sort of a minimum. Typical single-player gamers and some multiplayer gamers will use the highest quality visual settings that they can get away with while maintaining their minimum acceptable frame rate. And we know this to be true as we've polled this sort of information with over 100,000 of you in the past, and also it's logical. So by testing a modern AAA title at 4K using ultra quality settings that result in a GPU imposed limit at 60 FPS or lower, that's not going to be useful if you like to game at 90 FPS or more. Moreover, as I just touched on, if you're happy with 60 FPS or less, high-end CPUs aren't going to be a thing that you need to entertain. So high-end CPU reviews by default won't be relevant for you, as you don't require the product in question. Now, one of the key reasons for why it is important to determine the true gaming performance of a CPU through the use of low-resolution, CPU-limited gaming testing is because CPU performance doesn't scale anything like how GPU performance does. For example, if you were to game with a GeForce RTX 4070 and you wish to increase the frame rate in a game like Space Marine 2, there are numerous ways in which you can achieve this, providing you're not already CPU limited, of course. So, that is to say, bottlenecked by your CPU. Now, you might lower the resolution or enable upscaling. You could turn off or lower certain visual quality options, of which there are numerous. All of these things can drastically boost your FPS. But if your CPU can only throughput 80 FPS in a game like Space Marine 2, that's it. That's all you can ever hope to see. 80 FPS will be your ceiling, the cap for your performance. Lowering the resolution, enabling upscaling, disabling features in almost all instances will still see you limited to that 80 FPS ceiling. And it's rare to find a setting that will dramatically affect CPU performance. Normally there's pretty little you can do here. Some games you can increase or decrease the number of NPCs, for example, which can lessen or increase CPU load, but in most instances it doesn't really result in a significant performance change. So whereas GPU bottlenecks can almost always be mitigated by compromising on visuals, there's really little you can do when running into a CPU bottleneck. You've essentially hit a brick wall at that point. Therefore, when checking reviews for your next potential CPU upgrade, it is important to determine how CPU A really performs relative to CPU B, allowing you to make an informed purchase. Moreover, the purpose of a review is not to sell you a new processor or even upsell you on a processor. The 9800X3D is a seriously impressive gaming CPU, but if you already own a high-end gaming CPU, or just a high-end CPU such as the Core i9-14900K or Ryzen 7 7800X3D, you shouldn't feel pressured into the need to upgrade, as you still have a very capable, very sufficient gaming CPU, and the upgrade from either of those examples to a 9800X3D is only going to be very small in most instances. But again, it can depend, probably more so when comparing it to the Core i9-14900K, because the gap can get quite large there. But yeah, it depends on a lot of the things that we've already talked about. But I think the key thing to focus on here is that you shouldn't be looking at CPU reviews as some kind of incentive to upgrade. That's really not how it should work. And really what you should do is just monitor the performance of your system when gaming. First and foremost, is your system performing to a level that you're happy with? If so, then obviously you don't need to do anything, but if you are seeking additional performance, work out what is limiting you. Is it the CPU or your GPU? And the easiest way to do this is monitor GPU usage. If usage drops below 95%, you are likely CPU limited, and if it's well below that, then you're not getting anywhere near the full value out of your GPU, which is likely by far the most expensive component in your system. Now, if you do need a CPU upgrade, reviews and CPU benchmarking is certainly the best way to determine what you should buy, and crucially, low-resolution testing plays a key role in all of that. Not only does this show you the true performance of the CPU, but it also allows you to better assess the value when it comes to stuff like the cost per frame comparisons. For example, my 9800X 3D review acknowledges that AMD's latest 3D V-Cache CPU is now the world's fastest gaming CPU, but it's not the world's best value gaming CPU. That honor goes to something like the Ryzen 5 7500F, the 7600, or the 7600X as shown by the inclusion of the 7600X data. Likewise, to varying degrees, the 9600X, 7700X, and 9700X are all currently better value products than the 9800X 3D. So even if you happen to feel that low resolution testing isn't real world or that it upsells you on a CPU that you don't need, at least the latter of those arguments falls flat on its face when you look at the actual value of these parts in a cost per frame graph. Of course, as I said at the start of all of this, I realize the majority of you do get it. You understand what we're talking about here, and it is a vocal minority, typically speaking, that continue to try and fight against low resolution testing for whatever their reasons may be. But there are some newcomers that genuinely are confused by all of this, and well, they're the people that I suppose I'm trying to help with this updated content. But just a quick little message for those of you who refuse to get it for whatever reason. Have you ever wondered why there isn't a credible source, not one trusted person in the entire industry that evaluates CPU gaming performance that does so without heavily relying on low-resolution gaming benchmarks? The answer is there really isn't one. And while some reviewers do include 1440p and 4K benchmarks, they don't focus on them. They don't use them to shape out their conclusion or recommendations in any way. And personally, we've actually stopped with that testing after initially caving to the demand from some viewers, but having realized that it's, in my opinion, at best misleading and really of no value, we've pulled the plug on 1440p and 4K testing, and I'll show you exactly why in a moment. Now, I'm not saying we'll never do that testing. There's certainly GPU and CPU scaling content where it makes sense, but for the majority of our CPU reviews, we're not going to include those higher resolutions. Now, before we finally get into the benchmarks, and thank you for your patience on this one, let's quickly talk about how real-world 4K CPU benchmarking is, or maybe even just 4K benchmarking in general, though it is very useful for gauging the performance of GPUs. But in terms of real-world performance, most gamers who game at 4K don't do so at the native resolution. Rather, they enable upscaling technology such as FSR, DLSS, or XeSS, using either the performance, balance, or quality presets. And we recently polled this with about 30,000 of you, and 80% of those who voted said they do use upscaling. So I've decided to include some 4K DLSS balanced results, and there is a lot to go over. But let's start with a modern comparison between the Core Ultra 9 285K, the Ryzen 7 7700X, and the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D using the RTX 4090. First up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and at 1080p, the 285K and 7700X are neck and neck, while the 9800X 3D is brutally fast, delaying for 234 FPS, making it 51% faster. Now, you don't need 234 frames per second on average to enjoy this game, and in fact, 155 FPS on average is plenty. So the 285K and 7700X are certainly adequate here. But what this data tells us is that when placed under a heavy gaming load, the 9800X 3D can deliver 51% more performance, which is obviously a substantial increase. And although not particularly useful in this example, it almost certainly will be in the future. So if you're primarily gaming, you want to know this information before potentially spending $630 US on a 285K, opposed to what should be $480 US on the 9800X3D. Now, if we were to test at 4K with DLSS balanced upscaling enabled, we'd still find that the 9800X3D is indeed faster than the 285K and 7700X, though it's now just 16% faster. So there is still a performance benefit even under real-world conditions. But even so, everything we learnt from the 1080p data still remains true. The 285K and 7700X are more than fast enough in this title, both comfortably delivering a high refresh rate experience. But this also doesn't necessarily tell you how a more affordable GPU such as the RTX 4070 would perform, and that's because we're using the maximum or epic quality preset. If, for whatever reason, you require higher frame rates, you would simply downgrade the quality preset to high, or possibly even medium, which massively boosts performance. That is, of course, assuming that you have the CPU headroom. So again, GPU performance does scale massively with quality settings, CPU performance though, not so much. Now, the results we find here in The Last of Us Part 1 is what I think most people who claim low-resolution CPU testing is bad for whatever reason want to see. Here we see that the 9800X3D is 16% faster than the 7700X at 1080p, but just 1.4% faster at 4K with upscaling, and therefore the 9800X3D is pointless and offers 4K gamers nothing. This is both true and untrue at the same time almost. Ultimately, the real problem with such a statement is because it's just far too general. It paints all gamers with the same brush. And in this particular example, it's like most of the modern AAA games that we benchmark with. They're used more as a performance measurement tool rather than a performance guide for a specific game, though it can also be a bit of both. But in this particular example, at least with the CPUs we're looking at here, the actual FPS numbers themselves become somewhat irrelevant. You don't need over 200 FPS to play and enjoy The Last of Us Part 1. Most gamers, myself included, will be chuffed to bits with 140 FPS here. And all three of these CPUs are capable of delivering that level of performance, evidenced by what we see at 1080p. That being the case, enforcing any kind of GPU bottleneck just reveals the bleeding obvious. Yes, it lets you know that upgrading from a 7700X to a 9800X3D probably won't actually result in 16% greater performance than The Last of Us Part 1. But again, that should be obvious. The 7700X is spitting at 179 FPS on average at 1080p. So if you're happy with 140 FPS or 100 FPS or really any figure below what we see at 1080p, then the data is going to be GPU limited, not CPU limited. It's a similar story in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. The 9800X3D is 32% faster than the 7700X at 1080p, but just 5% faster at 4K with upscaling. That said, it will still be 17% faster than the 285K, which is a significant margin, though again, if you're happy with 140 FPS on average, then the 285K will certainly suffice, though that still makes it a poor value choice for gaming. In this example, Cyberpunk 2077 is being used more as a tool to help gauge the actual gaming performance of these CPUs, which gives us some insight into how they may age and which model will likely fare best in a few years' time. But unless you require over 200 FPS here, the 9800X3D isn't required to play this game. Now, a seriously CPU demanding modern title where the 4K argument falls apart, and I mean genuinely falls apart, is Hogwarts Legacy. At 1080p, the 9800X3D was a massive 37% faster than the 7700X, and 43% faster than the 285K. But if we increase the resolution to 4K with upscaling enabled, the 9800X3D is still 33% faster than the 7700X, and 35% faster than the 285K, so still massive margins. Not only are these massive margins, but they can be game-changing margins for those that like a truly high refresh rate experience. There is a genuine difference here. That said, we are using the high preset, so if you were to enable the ultra preset, it would reduce the margins further, along with the frame rate. So it comes back to that casual versus competitive frame rate discussion. If you're happy with 60 FPS, playing with all the eye candy turned up, including ray tracing, then CPU performance within reason doesn't really matter. You certainly don't need a 9800X3D. But if you're using Hogwarts Legacy as a tool to measure CPU performance as we are, it's clear that under heavy gaming loads, the 9800X 3D is vastly superior and will certainly ensure the best possible gaming experience. And in this example, that can even be learnt at 4K using the right settings, so the high preset with balanced upscaling. Now, there are games that are heavily CPU limited, and in these examples, the test resolution doesn't really matter. Take ACC for example. Here the 9800X 3D is a little over 70% faster than the 7700X and 285K at 1080p, and remained over 60% faster at 4K using DLSS upscaling. So in this example, using the higher resolutions doesn't change much, and this is a good representation of what we're looking for in a competitive setting. Not that I'm necessarily suggesting that ACC is a competitive title that requires high frame rates like a shooter would, though I also know those who play ACC care deeply about FPS performance. To what degree exactly, I'm not sure, but again, we're using it as another tool to measure CPU gaming performance. The Remnant II data is more similar to what we saw in Cyberpunk and The Last of Us Part 1, though the 9800X 3D is still offering additional performance at 4K, despite running into heavy GPU limits. Moreover, if 125 FPS isn't enough for you, and you'd rather 140 FPS or maybe more, we know based on the 1080p testing that with the right quality settings, the 9800X 3D will allow your GPU to go there, peaking at 158 FPS, whereas the 285K and 7700X simply cannot go that high. Now, it's games such as Homeworld 3 where you really want to see what the CPU has to offer, and being that this is such a CPU limited game, even at 4K, we find that the 9800X 3D is still 34% faster than the 7700X, though had we not used upscaling, the margin would be a bit smaller. But this is yet another example that heavily contradicts the statement CPUs don't matter at 1440p and 4K, because clearly they can, and in a meaningful way. Granted, you don't need seriously high frame rates to enjoy Homeworld 3, but personally I much prefer to play this game with well over 100 FPS rather than shy of 100 FPS. Panning around and controlling your units is just so much smoother and so much nicer. The A Plague Tale Requiem data is similar to the likes of Cyberpunk, meaning we do see significant performance margins at 1080p, but much less so at 4K. But again, this is a game that you can happily play on a 7700X, 159 FPS on average is plenty for this kind of game. That said, the 285K kind of stinks here. For a high-end flagship product that is, sure 120 FPS is playable, though the 1% lows will be a bit concerning. But overall, we're still seeing up to 42% better performance from the 9800X 3D at 4K, which is pretty wild. Now, our first real esports title and truly competitive shooter is Counter-Strike 2, and this game is featured in our Day 1 reviews to represent competitive shooters. So what we're looking at in this example applies to other games such as Valorant, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Warzone, and many more. In all of these examples, gamers are dialing the graphical quality settings down to medium or low, not just to increase FPS, but also to gain a competitive advantage, in the sense that there's less stuff on the screen that makes it easier to spot enemies and eliminate players. And this isn't just a thing pro players do, which is a bit of a misconception more casual gamers seem to have, who don't play these games, or at least not often. It's certainly not something just the top 1% of competitive gamers do. This is something a large number of multiplayer gamers do. And it's also something that many players start to lean into as they try to improve their skill level. As a result, those who play these games will almost always find themselves heavily CPU limited. Now, you can certainly make the argument that 500 FPS is absurd, and the 24% jump from 505 FPS of the 7700X to 626 FPS with the 9800X 3D at 4K is completely unnecessary. And for you personally, that could very well be the case. But I'm here to tell you that Counter-Strike 2 gamers are going bonkers over the 9800X 3D's performance. Our review data was spread far and wide throughout the CS2 communities, and everyone seems very excited by the performance uplift we're showing. Also, as a bit of a side note, I did have the pleasure of testing out a 540Hz gaming monitor at Competizione this year, and some of them have now been reviewed over at Monitors Unboxed. And let me tell you, the experience is mind-blowing. The difference between 240Hz that I'm used to and 540Hz is really night and day. It's a wild experience for those who play fast-paced shooters. So if that's something you can't even begin to fathom being the case, Be aware there are different levels to this. One level isn't necessarily better than another, it's just different, and you're after a different experience. Starfield is a super CPU limited game that was released late last year, and while the margins come down at 4K, the 9800X 3D is still enabling a slightly better experience, and of course you can lower the quality preset to push the frame rates back up to 140 FPS, or at least you can with the 9800X 3D, whereas you can't with the 7700X. Space Marine 2 is yet another super CPU limited game, and this one is very popular. Both the 7700X and 285K will limit you to just shy of 110 FPS in the more demanding sections of the game, basically during those big horde battles, which is what the game's really all about. Even at 4K, the 9800X 3D is enabling 21% greater performance than the 7700X, which is a massive performance uplift and a noticeably better experience with 131 FPS on average. Again, the game is certainly very playable and enjoyable even at 100 FPS. I'm not saying otherwise, I'm just saying for those of you who want the best experience and are willing to pay a premium for it, the 9800X 3D does deliver, and it does so under real-world conditions. Hitman 3 is almost 4 years old now, so it's one of the oldest games featured in our day one reviews, and the margins here aren't that big at 1080p, as these modern CPUs really aren't utilised heavy enough. We do still see some separation at 4K, but really, with well over 200 FPS, it doesn't mean much. But we do like to diversify the testing and include a few older games that were considered demanding for their time. It's a similar story with Watch Dogs Legion, though this game is still surprisingly demanding, though not to the degree that it is of any consequence for those actually playing it, given modern high-end CPUs have no issue pushing over 150 FPS. This is again being used as a benchmark tool, showing the 9800X 3D to be up to 32% faster at 1080p, but 23% faster at 4K when comparing 1% lows, which is still a big margin. Then we have Star Wars Outlaws, which was the only game where the 9800X 3D didn't really offer a performance gain at 1080p, so naturally the same is also true in lowering the frame rate via GPU limits. So here's a look at the average frame rate performance at 1080p. We found that the 9800X 3D was around 30% faster than the 7700X and 285K, whereas it was 17 to 21% faster at 4K using DLSS upscaling. So still a pretty solid performance gain there on average, but as we saw, it really does depend on the type of gamer you are as to how relevant this margin is, at least right now. Okay, so we've now established that there can actually be a difference at 4K under realistic conditions. Now, depending on the game and how you want to play the game, that difference can either be significant or pretty meaningless. And look, I'm sure some of you will be happy with the inclusion of the 4K data, but it is ultimately meaningless, and it tells us nothing that we can't learn from the 1080p data, and then cross-referencing that information with what a given GPU can achieve at a given resolution and quality settings. Learning what an RTX 4090 does at 4K with DLSS balance and whatever preset we happen to be using for testing almost certainly isn't going to help you or really tell you anything useful. But if I haven't convinced you yet, well then I give up. No, let's wind back the clock to 2022 and compare the Ryzen 9 3950X, Ryzen 5 5800X, and the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D in just 3 games that were released around that point in time. And yes, I did find a way to insert the 5800X 3D into this video, so good job me. The 3950X was still available in 2022, and it cost more than the 5800X 3D, but it packed twice as many cores. So it's a pretty interesting comparison for the purposes of this video. Now, if we compare these CPUs at 1080p using an RTX 3090 Ti, which was the flagship GPU used for testing back in 2022, we find the 5800X 3D is 21% faster than the 5800X and 36% faster than the 3950X. So if all parts were for some reason retailing for roughly the same price, you'd surely get the 5800X 3D, at least based on this data. But if I benchmarked at 4K with DLSS upscaling, doing so, we'd find frame rates that are limited to just shy of 100 FPS, as the 3090 Ti can't go any faster using the Ultra preset under these conditions. So would this data have been useful back in 2022? Well, only if you wanted to play Watch Dogs Legion at 4K with DLSS and the Ultra preset using an RTX 3090 Ti, and were therefore happy with 97 FPS on average. If you wanted 140 FPS, you would have had to lower the quality preset, and ideally purchased a 5800X 3D. It's a similar story in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, though 130 FPS is a much higher frame rate that almost all gamers will find perfectly acceptable. But in terms of gauging actual CPU performance in the hope of not just buying the best performing part in 2022, but also the CPU that would age the best, the 4K data couldn't be more useless. Whereas the 5800X 3D proved to be 42% faster than the 3950X at 1080p, it was just 2% faster at 4K. Horizon Zero Dawn shows a similar trend once again, and this time the 3090 Ti was good for 146 FPS at 4K, which is plenty of performance, but with all CPUs able to throughput over 170 FPS in this title, the 4K results are heavily GPU limited, and they don't really tell us anything about actual CPU performance. So, across just these three games featured back in our 2022 review, we found that the 5800X 3D was on average 15% faster than the 5800X, and 33% faster than the 3950X at 1080p, with an RTX 3090 Ti. But had we focused on the 4K upscaling results, we would have found that all three processors delivered identical performance. And for those of you who are seemingly opposed to low-resolution testing, this is what you'd learn. And it could result in any number of undesirable scenarios. For example, a novice PC builder might opt for the 3950X because it has twice as many cores and therefore logically it would age better. Essentially, you're going in blind and as a result could make any number of incorrect assumptions. And to see just how badly the wrong decision could have aged, let's see how these CPUs are getting on in more modern games with even more powerful gaming hardware. Starfield is a late 2023 release, and it's known to be very CPU limited in a number of the more NPC heavy sections. Here we see that whether the testing takes place at 1080p or 4K with upscaling, the results are a sharp contrast to what we saw in the 2022 sample. The 5800X and 3950X create a 100% CPU bottleneck, and the same is mostly true of the 5800X 3D. As a result, the 5800X 3D was 17% faster than the 5800X at 4K and 36% faster than the 3950X, margins that are in line with the averages seen previously at 1080p. We also find the exact same thing when testing with Space Marine 2. At 4K, the 5800X 3D is found to be 24% faster than the 5800X and a massive 46% faster than the 3950X, so we're looking at a completely different gaming experience when comparing these CPUs in a modern title at 4K with upscaling. Then we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, another super CPU demanding game, and while the 3950X and 5800X still perform quite well here, the 5800X 3D blows them out of the water, offering 38% more performance than the 5800X at 4K and 49% more than the 3950X. So if you were looking for a high refresh rate experience in this title, you'd be getting just that with the 5800X 3D, but not so much with the 5800X or 3950X. So the average graph here looks a lot different, and although this data is only based on an extremely small sample of games, and the games picked are deliberately CPU demanding, it's not like I'm using competitive shooters. At 4K, the 5800X 3D was on average 25% faster than the 5800X, and 44% faster than the 3950X. And those are some seriously significant margins. Of course, I am testing with an RTX 4090, but you'd see similar margins with, say, an RTX 4070 Super if you were to dial down the quality settings a little bit, because again, GPU performance can scale quite significantly. But what this points to is low-resolution testing showing actual CPU gaming performance, and is therefore a great predictor of future gaming performance, as has been clearly demonstrated here and many times in the past. So, here I am hoping that by this point in the video you understand why testing CPU performance with a strong GPU bottleneck is a bad idea, and significantly more misleading than the well-established test methods used by almost all tech media outlets. I get why some viewers prefer what is often referred to as real world, but in the context of CPU testing, it doesn't actually tell you what you think it tells you, unless of course, you plan on using the exact same hardware combination that we used under the exact same conditions. Moreover, CPU reviews aren't meant to be used as some kind of incentive to upgrade your CPU or upsell you on a more expensive CPU. That's not at all the goal of low-resolution testing. The goal is to inform you of the real performance and value the CPU offers in today's games in the most demanding sections, and this often gives you a glimpse of how things might look in the future. There's also a few things you need to work out on your end in regards to whether or not you actually need a CPU upgrade, and if you do, what that actually looks like. As I've said multiple times in this video, if you're more of a casual gamer, so you primarily play single-player games and you're happy doing so at around 60 FPS, the chances are you're not going to be CPU limited anyway, unless you have a super old CPU, and if that is the case, you're probably more interested in a cost-effective upgrade, something like the Ryzen 5 7600 or Ryzen 7 7700X. And looking at the average frame rate performance from our most recent day one CPU review, we see that the 7600X was good for 166 FPS on average, while the slower CPU tested, the Core i5 12600K, was good for 139 FPS. So that being the case, it's extremely unlikely that any modern CPU won't be able to deliver the kind of performance you deem acceptable in the latest and greatest games. And we even saw that the old Ryzen 9 3950X was able to deliver on average just shy of 80 FPS in the 3 demanding games that we tested with. So, step 1. Work out if your system's gaming performance is CPU limited, and if so, work out what you'd like to spend on your CPU upgrade. And you can check out any of our cost per frame data graphs to work out what the best value options are. Alternatively, if you are after high-end CPU performance and you want the best of the best, well, you need not look at cost per frame data, simply buy the fastest CPU, which right now happens to be the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. And the low-resolution benchmarks prove this, and I'm confident future titles will show similar results to what we saw when comparing the Ryzen 3000 and 5000 series processors. Anyway, as always, I look forward to all the negative comments about 1080p benchmarking in future CPU reviews. That'll be a fun time, and I guess it's easy engagement after all, so what am I complaining about? But yeah, hopefully for those of you who were a bit confused by this subject, in all seriousness, I do hope that this video was helpful, because that really is the point of it. So yeah, and there's multiple other videos which I'll link in the description which also talk about the subject and show it from different angles. I mean, you could just test all day and show how many different ways you can go about this. It's limitless essentially, and there'll always be but what about this, but what about that, and I try to address as much of that as I can. So this is sort of a different angle for the most part that I've taken compared to the last few videos. Anyway, watch those if you're interested. I don't know, after watching this video, I don't know why I'd want to watch any more of this stuff, but hey, maybe you found it interesting. Also, if you did find it interesting, hit the like button, subscribe. I probably won't make another one of these videos for another 2 years, but I can't promise that. Maybe AMD or Intel will try and sell you an inferior processor by heavily GPU limiting it and claiming that it's as fast or faster than the competition's processor, which will be a big old fat lie, and I'll have to expose that. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but you never know. They never seem to learn their lesson. But anyway, yeah, like, subscribe. We have the join button if you want to become a member. Access our Discord server. We talk about this sort of stuff all the time. We have live streams where you can ask us any question about this stuff live, and we will just answer it for you right there. So do that if you want, I guess. But otherwise, I'm your host, Steve. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you again next time.